BYU football has a massive concern when it comes to the defensive tackle position. I'm not trying to make this like woe is BYU football, but considering in light of Semi Taulanga committing to the University of Utah as a defensive tackle at a modern-day high school down in Southern California, there was a lot of hope that BYU would be able to pull off a recruiting win and steal him away from UCLA and obviously Utah, where he committed. The issue I see right now for BYU defensive tackle is on paper, there's not a lot of ready-made options for BYU on that roster defensive tackle. I think are going to step up and be stars for BYU this fall in a position group, by the way, that was much maligned a year ago. Injuries, just ineffective play, really dampened BYU's ability to hold up, especially against the run in their debut season in the Big 12 Conference. If Jay Hill's defense is to succeed with BYU, he needs defensive tackles that can eat up blockers, provide some pass rush, but also make it miserable for opposing game planners, speaking of offensive coordinators, to really game plan, because they cannot envision a way to get around these defensive, in theory, have on their defensive line. Utah has a ton of talent on that defensive front, and Semi Taulanga seems to just be the cherry on top of what has been a rich tradition at Utah. I saw some of the social media posts that were up there when Semi Taulanga committed to Utah from BYU fans saying, what is BYU going to do at defensive tackle? And it's a very valid question. I had a few of you send me a text and or comments asking me to talk about this, and let's get into it. Here's the issue that BYU faces right now is why would any star defensive tackle look at BYU's defense and say, you know what, that's where I want to go play? There's not been a really strong tradition of it, really dating back to Khyiris Tonga. And even before that, who else from BYU's defensive front has been a standout that has been somebody that BYU players say, you know what, that's what I want to go do. I want to go play for the BYU Cougars at defensive tackle and really get tied up with multiple opposing offensive linemen every single play. BYU has to find a way to highlight their defensive tackles to give them some hope of recruiting higher profile defensive linemen to join the BYU football program. In the recruiting sphere right now, going into the 2025 cycle for BYU, is there's not a lot out there for BYU. Could some guys emerge during this upcoming prep football season? I sure as heck hope so, because BYU right now, if you look at 24/7 and On3 and look at the offers that BYU has out to defensive linemen, there's just not a lot of guys out there, and there's not a lot of ready-made, oh, that's a guy that BYU should be chasing right now. They very well may have to look at the transfer portal and or junior college ranks once again to bolster this position group. Looking at the season ahead right now, you're hoping that John Nelson and some combo of Luke To'omalatai, David Latu, if Blake Mangelson truly is moving inside the defensive tackle, you're hoping that a combination of those guys or other guys on the roster, because the defensive tackle position for BYU does not look all that appetizing. It's nothing against Joshua Singh, Tyler Little, Dallin Havea, Dallin Johnson, John Taumoepeau, Iosefa Latuli. Those are all the other names at the defensive tackle position for BYU on the roster right now. And which of them in your mind screams, I am going to be that guy for BYU at defensive tackle? They need one of them to stand out. And I believe that John Nelson has the capability of doing that. But his issue is he's not stayed healthy for an entire season in quite some time for BYU. He's going into his senior season. If he has hopes of playing professionally, obviously having a healthy senior campaign will do wonders for him to accomplish that goal. But who else is going to step up alongside him? Is it going to be David Latu, who showed promise at points during last season as a junior college transfer into the program? Can he really emerge and be a force for BYU? Or is it going to be John Taumoepeau as a guy who is probably undersized for the position? Can he start to show out? When Danny Saili decided to leave BYU following spring ball, that thinned out a defensive tackle position that really needed a guy like him to be a rock in the middle of that defensive line. Now you're going to be hoping that guys that are weighing 285, 305, 295 pounds are capable of holding up against offensive lines that are very, very talented at the Power 4 level, especially in the Big 12. BYU had a lot of questions when it came to defending the run a year ago, and the defensive tackle spot really hasn't gotten much better than it was a year ago in my mind. Now, I'd love to be wrong about this. I'd love to show up mid-season and say, wow, BYU's defensive line is absolutely kicking butt out there, and the defensive tackles are absolutely holding their own. And if they do that, I'll give mad props to guys like Sione Po'uha, Chad Kauha'aha'a, and also Gary Andersen, who are all on BYU staff, whether it's as a position coach in the case of Po'uha, a defensive analyst, or I guess the senior analyst on BYU staff in the case of Chad K, or just as a consultant in the case of Gary Andersen. You need to have those guys earn their paychecks by coaching up this defensive tackle front, because right now, I've got little to no faith that it's going to get much better for BYU in this near-term future, because I just don't see where the options are coming from at defensive tackle, and also the future of that position group. Man, there's a dearth of talent, at least on the recruiting front right now for BYU, that's not already committed elsewhere. Could BYU flip Semi Taulanga at some point down the line? Maybe so, but I would not be betting on that, because he went through a very public recruiting battle with BYU, Utah, and UCLA in the mix for him. And he ultimately opted to pick the University of Utah, where they've got a defensive line that goes 3 and 4 guys deep at multiple positions. BYU right now, I'm having a hard time envisioning a 2 deep that has not got questions for me at defensive tackle. That's how thin I believe this position group is for the Cougars going into training camp. And you're going to have to see an uptick at some point, whether it is the current crop of guys on the defensive front for BYU that decides to make me eat crow, or if you have all of a sudden some kid, whether it's from Timpview High School up the road in Provo, or somebody clear across the country during the upcoming prep season who really emerges, the BYU can latch onto early in the season and really kind of sell them on what BYU has to offer them. But until that happens, I'm going to remain skeptical about BYU's defensive line, especially at defensive tackle. It's got to become a strength for BYU for Jay Hill's defense to truly succeed at the level he wants it to succeed at in Provo. But without standout defensive linemen who are more than capable of eating up multiple offensive line blocks, being able to withstand double and triple teams, being able to provide some pass rush from the interior, especially when it comes to the nose and defensive tackle positions, without that, this is a defense that is fatally flawed, and that is a massive, massive concern for any Cougar fan out there, because without standout defensive line play, the history suggests that the defense that obviously has been coached up by Kyle Whittingham has been imparted to guys like Kalani Sitake, Gary Andersen, Sione Po'uha, who are all now coaching at BYU. They know it's imperative that you have those defensive linemen that can really step up and be the stars and the unsung heroes of the defense. Linebackers, defensive backs probably are going to get the headlines in a defense like that, but any of them who know what they're talking about will give credit to the defensive linemen in front of him. And right now, it does not look all that great for BYU's defensive line. And once again, I just don't see ready-made options out on the recruiting front either. And that should lead you to have some concern about what BYU is trying to do. Does that mean you may need to make a change at the defensive tackle coach's spot? I'm not saying that that needs to happen right away, but you got to see an uptick at some point. And if it doesn't happen soon, once again, that defense may be doomed to fail before it really gets started with Jay Hill as BYU's defensive coordinator. But it's a really, really kind of curious balance that BYU is trying to strike here, and we'll see if they really can find an answer for it in training camp and also on the recruiting front, because they absolutely have to find those answers, or else they're going to have an issue for seemingly years to come under Kalani Sitake's tenure as BYU head coach.